The rain had started before dawn, not with drama, but with that steady, resigned tapping against the window that made the world feel smaller than it was. In apartment 4B of an aging brick building on the south side of Chicago, Elena Cruz stood in her kitchen wearing her work uniform and staring at the thermometer in her hand as if sheer concentration might lower the number. 103.1. Her son Mateo lay curled on the old couch in the next room. His cheeks flushed bright with fever, his breathing shallow but even, one small hand wrapped around the frayed ear of a stuffed rabbit that had once been white and was now the color of old paper. He was 6 years old, too thin for his age, with lashes so long they made his tired face look even more delicate. Every few minutes he would stir, whisper something incoherent, and sink again into a restless half-sleep. Elena closed her eyes. She had already called the school to say he would not be coming. She had already called the neighbor who sometimes watched him. No answer. She had already called the woman from the next building over who occasionally sat with children for $20 a day. Her husband had left 2 years earlier with promises that dissolved as quickly as breath in winter air. Her mother lived in another state and had a heart too weak for travel. Her phone screen still held the proof of her failure. 7 unanswered calls, 3 desperate messages, and 1 final text from her supervisor sent at 5:42 a.m. If you missed today, don't bother coming back this week. Elena worked in the executive dining floor of Hale Meridian Tower, the kind of polished steel skyscraper that looked as though it had been built by men who never once had to choose between medicine and rent. She had only been there 3 weeks. She was still in her probationary period. They said the kitchen ran on precision, silence, and timing. They said Victor Hale, the owner of the building and the man whose name floated across business magazines like a warning label, valued discipline above all else. People called him the Winter Man when they thought nobody important could hear. He had built an empire in logistics, healthcare real estate, and corporate consulting. He was worth more money than Elena could have imagined even in her boldest fantasies. He was 39, unmarried, unsmiling, and so exacting that senior executives straightened their jackets when his elevator opened. He was not known for second chances. He was certainly not known for mercy. Elena looked again at Mateo. If she stayed home, they would fire her. If she left him alone, she would never forgive herself. If she took him with her and anyone found out, they would fire her anyway. The mind in crisis does not always choose wisely. Sometimes it simply chooses the least impossible disaster. She crossed to the couch and knelt beside him. "Mateo," she whispered, touching his damp forehead. His eyes opened a little. "Mama, I need you to be very brave for me." He made the smallest nod. He was always brave in the way children of struggling mothers often are. Not because life has been kind to them, but because they have learned that their courage becomes part of the furniture of the house. "I have to go to work," she said, and the words tasted like shame. "I'm going to keep you with me, just for a little while. There's a quiet place. You can rest there. I'll check on you every chance I get." "Will I be in trouble?" he asked. The question nearly broke her. "No, baby," she said quickly. "No, you'll be with me." He believed her because children are built to believe the people who hold them. By 6:30, the rain had thickened. Elena wrapped him in his blue coat, tucked the rabbit into his arms, packed his inhaler, fever medicine, a bottle of water, a small thermos of broth, and a blanket into her canvas bag, then carried him down 4 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken since February and the landlord kept promising it would be fixed soon. Mateo's feverish head rested against her shoulder. He smelled of cough syrup, shampoo, and sleep. Outside, the city was all wet pavement and blurred headlights. Elena held him tighter as she hurried to the bus stop, the rain soaking the hem of her pants. Every step she took felt like a prayer with no words. By the time they reached Hale Meridian Tower, the glass facade was reflecting a sky the color of pewter. The lobby was already glowing with expensive light. Marble floors, silver planters, security guards with earpieces, men in dark coats moving as if their urgency had a salary attached to it. Elena kept her eyes down. She signed in with her staff badge, murmured a thank you to the guard who barely glanced up, and slipped Matteo through the side employee entrance toward the service elevators. On the 32nd floor, beyond the kitchens and the pantry, there was a storage room used for linen overflow and seasonal decor. It was warm, quiet, and rarely visited before noon. She had seen it on her second day and thought then, absurdly, it would make a decent hiding place. Now that terrible thought became her plan. Inside the little room, she spread a folded blanket over 2 stacked crates and settled Matteo down as gently as she could. His eyes were glassy. "I'll come back in 10 minutes, she said. "You said that last time I was sick," he murmured, too drowsy to accuse, but the words cut anyway. Elena smoothed his hair. "And I came back every time." She gave him medicine, set the water beside him, and kissed his forehead. "Do not come out, okay? If you need me, call me on the little phone." It was an old phone without service, loaded only with a single game and the ability to reach her on the building app over the employee Wi-Fi. Matteo liked pressing the buttons even when it didn't work. He nodded, clutching the rabbit tighter. Elena turned off the bright overhead light, left the softer lamp on, and closed the door to a narrow crack. Then she walked back into the stainless steel brightness of the kitchen and tied on her apron with hands that would not stop trembling. The executive breakfast service began at 7. It was the kind of morning that punished hesitation. Coffee urns needed replacing, fruit platters had to be angled just so, pastries arranged, meeting trays counted, silverware polished again even though it already shone. Chef Bernard barked times and temperatures like military orders. The assistant floor manager, Patricia Sloan, moved through the room on narrow heels and sharper instincts, spotting mistakes the way vultures spot movement. Patricia was a woman whose face was always composed in a version of disappointment. She liked rules because rules gave her the pleasure of withholding grace. "Elena," she said once, not loudly, but with enough frost to make the younger woman flinch. "You are 3 minutes behind on conference room B." "I'm sorry," Elena answered. Patricia looked at her for a beat too long. "Try not to bring your personal disorganization into my service floor." Elena swallowed and said nothing. At 7:18, she checked on Matteo. He was asleep. At 7:41, she checked again. He was awake, but quieter than before, his lips dry. "How are you feeling?" she whispered. "Hot." She gave him water, brushed his forehead, and forced a smile she did not feel. "Just a little longer." At 8:05, one of the executives sent back an omelet because the spinach was too assertive. At 8:17, a tray of fresh juice tipped sideways and had to be remade. At 8:29, Patricia told Elena that Victor Hale himself would be attending the quarterly leadership lunch upstairs at noon and that every station would be subject to inspection. The room changed when his name was mentioned. It always did. Even people who disliked him adjusted themselves in the shadow of his expectation. Elena's stomach dropped. At 8:34, she went back to the storage room. It was empty. For a second her mind refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. The blanket was crumpled. The bottle of water had rolled into the corner. The stuffed rabbit lay face down near the crates. But Matteo was not there. A coldness passed through her so total it felt like someone had opened her ribs. "Matteo?" she hissed. No answer. She searched behind the racks, behind boxes of folded tablecloths, under the hanging garment bags. Nothing. Then she saw the door, not half closed as she had left it, but open wider than before. Elena ran. She moved through the service corridor, then the main hallway, scanning every polished surface, every doorway, every impossible inch of a floor designed for adults with money and schedules and no room for lost children. Her heart hammered so hard she could barely hear herself calling his name under her breath. At the far end of the executive corridor, just outside the private board lounge, the impossible scene came into focus. A little boy in a blue coat stood swaying near the wall, one hand pressed weakly against the dark wood paneling. And kneeling in front of him, one knee on the gleaming stone, was Victor Hale. Elena stopped so abruptly she nearly slipped. He was taller than photographs suggested, broad-shouldered, severe in a charcoal suit that looked expensive enough to pay 6 months of her rent. His hair was black threaded faintly with silver at the temples, his jaw cut hard, his face composed in the kind of restraint most people mistook for cruelty. Yet in that moment, with one hand bracing Mateo's shoulder and the other pressed gently to the child's forehead, he looked not cold but alarmed. "Sir," Elena began, breathless. Victor Hale looked up. His eyes were a clear gray, not empty as gossip claimed, but sharp enough to make lying feel useless. "This child is burning with fever," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Is he yours?" Elena's legs felt hollow. "Yes, I'm so sorry. I had no one." Before she could finish, Mateo's knees buckled. Victor caught him, not awkwardly, not with the stiff disgust of a man unaccustomed to touch. He caught him with both arms and lifted him against his chest as if he had done such a thing before, as if the weight of a sick child was not an intrusion into his mourning but the only fact that mattered. It happened so fast that the hallway seemed to fall silent around it. A vice president emerging from the elevator stopped mid-step. Patricia Sloane, turning the corner with a tablet in hand, froze so completely one might have thought she had walked into a photograph. Two assistants near the conference doors looked openly stunned. Victor Hale did not appear to notice any of them. "Call Dr. Weiss to the executive clinic," he said to no one and everyone at once. One of the assistants blinked. "Right away, sir." He shifted Mateo higher in his arms. The child's flushed face turned instinctively into the starched lapel of his suit. Elena stared, not understanding the world she was in anymore. "Come with me," Victor said. He did not ask. He walked. The executive clinic occupied a discreet suite on the 33rd floor used for investors with chest pains, executives with stress migraines, and occasional PR-friendly acts of corporate benevolence. Elena had never seen the inside. She only knew it existed because someone once joked that it was where wealthy men went to discover they were merely tired. Now she followed Victor Hale through glass doors into a room lined with pale wood, soft light, and a silence so carefully engineered it almost felt expensive in itself. He laid Mateo on an examination bed with astonishing gentleness. Dr. Weiss arrived within minutes, silver-haired and brisk. She checked the child's temperature, oxygen, throat, lungs. Elena stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched white. "Severe viral infection, likely compounded by dehydration," the doctor said at last. "No sign of pneumonia at the moment, but he should never have been left unattended in this condition." The words landed like stones. Elena opened her mouth to apologize, but no apology seemed large enough. "We'll bring the fever down," Dr. Weiss continued. "He needs fluids, close monitoring, and rest. If his breathing worsens, we send him to the hospital immediately." Mateo whimpered. Elena stepped closer, but Victor was already adjusting the blanket over the child's legs. Only then did Patricia Sloane appear in the doorway, her expression professionally horrified. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I need to inform you that bringing outside individuals into the executive floors is a direct violation of—" Victor did not turn around. "Ms. Sloane," he said evenly, "if the next sentence out of your mouth contains the word violation before it contains the word doctor, I will assume your priorities are incompatible with this company." The room went still. Patricia's color changed slightly. "I know what you were doing." He faced her then, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "You may leave." She left. Elena had never seen power behave so quietly and still feel like thunder. Mateo's fever did not break quickly. He drifted in and out, sometimes asking for water, sometimes whispering nonsense, once crying weakly for his mother in a voice so small Elena thought her heart might stop altogether. She sat beside him and held his hand, unable to stop the tremor in her own. Victor Hale remained in the room long after any normal man of his station would have gone. At first Elena assumed he was waiting for an update. Then she assumed he was staying to make sure the scandal was contained. Then, as the minutes became an hour, and the hour became almost 2, she stopped assuming anything. He took off his jacket and folded it over the chair. He loosened his tie. He stood by the window making 2 phone calls in a voice so controlled it was impossible to tell which billion-dollar concern he was postponing or canceling. Once Elena heard him say, "Reschedule the board lunch. No, not shorten it. Reschedule it." At 10:14, Matteo woke fully enough to cry because his head hurt. Victor crossed the room, lifted the small cup of ice chips, and held it out. "Can you try one?" he asked. Matteo blinked up at him. The child had reached that strange feverish honesty where fear disappears and only curiosity remains. "You're the man from the big picture downstairs," he said hoarsely. There was, in fact, a massive black and white portrait of Victor Hale in the lobby, looking as if human affection had once offended him personally. A ghost of something almost like amusement flickered at the corner of Victor's mouth. "So I'm told. You look less angry up close." Elena made a shocked sound. "Matteo." But Victor said, "Do I?" Matteo nodded seriously. "A little." For one suspended second, the room held its breath. Then Victor Hale, the winter man, the terror of quarterly reports, the coldest millionaire in Chicago according to people who liked that sort of exaggeration, gave the faintest smile Elena had ever seen. It was small and uncertain, like a door opening only an inch after years of being sealed shut. Changed his whole face. The boy accepted the ice chip from his hand as if this were the most natural exchange in the world. Later, when Dr. Weiss stepped out to review the medication order, Victor approached Elena near the coffee station. "You said you had no one," he said. It was not an accusation. That almost made it worse. Elena looked down at her damp sleeves. "My sitter canceled. My neighbor works double shifts. My son's school called yesterday and said he should stay home if the fever continued. I knew that. Her voice thinned. I just couldn't lose this job." He waited. And because fatigue erodes pride, and because there are moments when the truth comes out simply because the body is too tired to stage manage it, Elena kept going. "I'm behind on rent," she said. "His inhaler refill cost more than I expected this month. My last job cut hours. This one was supposed to be the reset. I know what I did was wrong. I know it. I wasn't trying to use the company or cause trouble. I had to choose between being a bad employee and a bad mother, and I think maybe I became both." The last words came out ragged. Victor's expression did not soften in the obvious way compassionate people are expected to soften. He did not lean forward or offer pity. But something in his gaze sharpened, not against her, but against whatever arrangement of the world had placed her in that equation. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena Cruz." "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks. "And Matteo's father?" The silence answered before she did. "He left," she said. 2 years ago. Different city. Different promises." Victor looked past her toward the bed where the little boy now slept again, cheeks still flushed but breathing more evenly. When he spoke next, his voice had lowered. "My mother worked in a garment warehouse when I was 8. Elena blinked. This was not the direction she expected. "He had a fever," Victor continued, and she realized after a moment that he was not speaking of some other child. He was speaking of himself. "Hi." Persistent. "She brought me in because she had no one and because one day's wages meant groceries. The foreman found out. He called her irresponsible in front of 30 people. Fired her on the spot." The room felt smaller. "I'm sorry," Elena said quietly. His jaw tightened once. "I remember less of the fever than I do the look on her face. Not because she was ashamed of loving me. Because she had been forced to make love look like negligence." Elena stared at him. There are moments when the grand stories people tell about powerful men collapse all at once and reveal the child-shaped bruise underneath. She saw it then, not sentimentally, but with the cold clarity of recognition. Whatever Victor Hale had built around himself had not erased where he came from. It had only frozen it. "She found another job," he said. "Eventually, we survived. People call that resilience. Sometimes it is only the afterlife of humiliation." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Dr. Weiss returned with an update. Matteo's fever was beginning to respond. The crisis was not over, but the immediate danger had eased. Relief swept through Elena so fast she had to grip the counter. "You should eat something," Victor said. "I'm fine. That was not a question." An hour later, an orderly brought soup, toast, fruit, and tea for Elena, and a tray with broth and crackers set aside for Matteo when he woke. No one in the room remarked on who had ordered it. No one needed to. By late afternoon, the rain had deepened into a gray curtain over the city. Matteo sat up long enough to sip broth and ask whether he had made his mother lose her job. "No," Elena said immediately, her throat closing. "Never think that." Victor stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the storm. Without turning, he said, "Your mother's employment status is not your burden." Matteo looked at him gravely. "Are you the boss of everything?" A pause. "Not everything. Almost everything?" Victor glanced back. "More than is healthy." Matteo considered this. "Then you can tell them not to be mean." The line might have sounded childish from anyone else. In that room it landed with unnerving precision. Victor held the boy's gaze. "Yes," he said at last. "I believe I can." That evening, Elena expected to be escorted out with formal condolences and a severance packet disguised as concern. Instead, Victor informed her that Matteo would remain in the clinic overnight under observation and that a driver would take them both to a company apartment nearby once Dr. Weiss approved discharge. Elena stared at him. "I can't accept that." "You can," he said. "I don't want charity." "Good," he answered. "Neither do I." The words might have sounded harsh from another man. From him, they sounded precise. "This is not charity, Miss Cruz. This is correction." Correction. He stepped closer, but not into her space. "A company that profits from human labor while pretending human need is an inconvenience has made a strategic and moral error. Your son is in this room because that error met your desperation. I intend to understand how often that happens." Elena did not know what to say. He continued, "Temporary housing. Paid leave for 72 hours. Full medical coverage for Matteo until this episode is resolved. After that, we discuss what is sustainable." She stared at him as if he had begun speaking another language. "Why?" she whispered. His eyes moved briefly to the sleeping child. "Because once," he said, "someone had the power to stop a humiliation and chose not to. I have no desire to resemble him." The next 3 days altered the shape of several lives. Matteo recovered in the furnished corporate apartment on the 12th floor of a neighboring building, a place intended for out-of-town consultants but now holding the strange domesticity of soup on the stove, children's medicine lined up by the sink, and a little boy watching cartoons under a blanket while rain traced the window panes. Elena moved through it with the careful disbelief of someone afraid kindness might still have conditions she had not yet discovered. Each morning a driver took them to the clinic for a checkup. Each afternoon Dr. Weiss pronounced him a little stronger. On the second day Victor came by with a paper bag from a bookstore. "For Matteo," he said. Inside were 3 children's books about trains, planets, and dinosaurs. Matteo looked at him with solemn admiration. "You bought all 3? "Yes. That's a lot of money." "It is manageable." For the first time in years, Elena laughed without meaning to. Matteo's recovery uncovered a second illness that had been harder to diagnose because it belonged not to the body but to the structure of the workplace itself. Victor began asking questions. Not loud questions. That would have warned people. He asked in the quiet, surgical way of men who know that truth often walks more willingly into silence than into courtroom light. How many probationary employees had caregiving responsibilities? Why had the Employee Hardship Fund paid out less than 3% of its annual allocation last year? Why had family leave requests from hourly workers been denied at triple the rate of those from salaried staff? Why did the executive kitchen report excess waste while cafeteria workers described skipped meals and unpaid breaks? He asked for numbers, not narratives. And because numbers cannot flatter the way subordinates do, the picture sharpened quickly. The hardship fund had not been underused. It had been obstructed. Requests were routinely deferred for review until the emergency passed or the employee quit. Forms disappeared. Hours were manipulated so workers missed benefit thresholds by fractions. Patricia Sloan, in coordination with a regional operations director named Martin Kessler, had quietly cultivated a culture where need itself was seen as disqualifying. Workers with sick parents, disabled children, transportation failures, housing instability, or pregnancy complications were marked as unreliable operational risks. The language was elegant. The effect was cruel. Victor spent 2 evenings reviewing files in his office. The city burned gold beyond the glass while his lamp cast a pool of white over spreadsheets, personnel notes, and reimbursement trails. More than once he found himself staring not at the data but at the old memory he had not touched in years. A warehouse floor, fluorescent lights. His mother's face going blank as a man in a brown tie told her rules were rules. He had spent 2 decades becoming untouchable because he believed power would protect him from ever witnessing that kind of helplessness again. Instead, he had built a system where it multiplied out of his sight. On the 4th morning, Elena returned to work. She had expected whispers. She got them. People looked up when she entered the kitchen. A few gave quick sympathetic nods. Others glanced away too fast. Patricia Sloan said nothing for the first hour, which somehow felt more threatening than if she had spoken. Then, at 10:20, Elena found an incident report on the prep table. Unauthorized presence of non-employee minor in restricted executive area. Gross negligence. Endangerment risk. Her name was typed at the top. Attached was a notice recommending immediate termination pending review. Her breath caught. Before she could process that blow, Chef Bernard motioned her toward the dry storage pantry. "There's more," he muttered. Inside, hidden behind stacked flour bins, was a cardboard box containing unopened bottles of imported olive oil, premium coffee tins, and specialty cutlery. Taped to the lid was a note in block letters. Found in Elena Cruz's locker. The world tilted. It was so clumsy, so obvious, that for a second she could not believe anyone would dare attempt it. Then she remembered how institutions work. Obvious lies often succeed when told about people with no insulation. "I didn't do this," she whispered. Bernard looked miserable. "I know, but Sloan's sending security in 20 minutes. Elena stood frozen, every old fear rushing back at once. The apartment, the medicine, Matteo, the impossible, humiliating fragility of beginning again. Then a voice behind her said, "No need." Victor Hale stood in the doorway. He was alone except for a man Elena recognized vaguely from compliance and a woman from legal carrying a slim file. Patricia Sloan stood several paces behind them, all careful innocence. Victor's gaze moved from the box to Elena's face. "Ms. Cruz," he said calmly, "would you mind stepping into conference room C?" Inside the conference room, the glass walls had been switched to privacy mode. Elena sat at one end of the table, hands clenched in her lap. Victor remained standing. Patricia entered with the rigid poise of someone who still believed the narrative could be managed. "Mr. Hale," she said, "this is regrettable, but under the circumstances." "Sit down," he said. She sat. The compliance officer opened a tablet. The legal woman placed 3 printed pages on the table. Victor looked at Patricia. "At 9:42 this morning, you used your access card to enter staff locker bay 4. At 9:44, Martin Kessler used his card to enter dry storage. At 9:47, the security camera overlooking the west corridor was disabled for 4 minutes. At 9:52, this box was placed in the pantry. At 10:03, the incident notice was printed from your terminal." Patricia's face lost color 1 degree at a time. "I can explain." "I doubt that," Victor said. She turned toward Elena as if outrage itself might save her. "This is absurd. She violated policy. Her child was found." "Yes," Victor said. "Her child was found with a dangerous fever because a managerially cultivated climate of fear made an employee believe she would be punished for being a mother." Patricia swallowed. "I was protecting standards." Victor's eyes were like winter glass. "No, you were protecting optics. There is a difference, and the second is cheaper." The legal woman slid another page forward. "We also found evidence of withheld hardship applications, altered attendance records, and redirected discretionary wellness funds." Patricia looked abruptly toward the door, where Martin Kessler had just appeared after being summoned in. One glance at the file told him the shape of the disaster. Sweat gathered at his temples. Victor let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then he said, "You both mistook invisibility for consent." No one moved. "At noon," he continued, "there will be a leadership meeting in the main boardroom. You will attend. You will say nothing unless asked direct questions." He turned to Elena. "As for you, Ms. Cruz, you are not terminated." The force of relief was so violent she had to look down. "However," he added, "I have a better use for your abilities than allowing you to spend the next year slicing fruit under people who cannot recognize integrity when it stands in front of them." She blinked. "I don't understand." "You will report, effective Monday, to the newly formed Employee Care and Operations Desk." Elena stared at him. He continued matter-of-factly, "You have first-hand knowledge of where our system fails. Chef Bernard also tells me you reorganized the inventory flow on your second day and cut prep waste by 12% without being asked." Chef Bernard, if asked later, would deny ever having spoken to Victor Hale about anything. But his ears went pink. "I just moved labels," Elena said faintly. "Competence is often described that way by the people who possess it." At noon, the boardroom filled with vice presidents, directors, and regional managers expecting a routine discussion about quarter-end strategy. Instead, they got Victor Hale standing at the head of the table without a jacket, without notes, and without the remote smile he used at investor events. The city stretched beyond the glass behind him. Chicago River below, clouded sky above, wealth everywhere, and in the middle of it, a reckoning. He did not begin with the fraud. He began with a story. "4 days ago," he said, "a 6-year-old boy with a fever of 103 was found alone outside this corridor." The room went still. "His mother works in this building. She made a terrible decision. She made it because she believed our policies had left her no survivable alternative." No one interrupted him. She was not the only one. Then came the numbers. Denied leave requests, buried applications, benefit evasion, manipulated part-time thresholds, medical emergencies ignored until they became absences, and absences turned into dismissals. The words were clean. The effect was devastating. Finally, he addressed Patricia and Martin directly. "You weaponized compliance against vulnerability. You converted bureaucracy into cruelty. And because you were efficient while doing it, you appear to have mistaken yourselves for valuable." No one in the room breathed. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Legal will handle the rest." Security did not need to enter. The humiliation of being seen plainly was already enough. Then Victor did something even more startling. He announced structural changes. A real hardship fund with transparent review. Emergency childcare partnerships. Flexible care leave for hourly workers. On-site pediatric support during peak crisis seasons. Paid caregiver days. A quiet room on every major staff floor. And a foundation named for Anna Hale, his mother, dedicated to supporting working parents in high-pressure labor environments. Several executives shifted in discomfort when he explained the cost. "If you are wondering whether this will affect margins," he said, "yes. A company unable to absorb the price of human decency has mistaken itself for a machine." By the time the meeting ended, the culture of Hale Meridian Tower had cracked open. What replaced it did not arrive in one noble wave. Systems rarely transform that way. But the direction changed and people felt it. Elena spent the next months learning a new job she had never imagined for herself. The Employee Care and Operations Desk began as one converted office with 2 battered chairs, a printer that jammed twice daily, and a whiteboard full of problems nobody had bothered to measure before. Bus route gaps, sick child emergencies, elder care conflicts, medication delays, lost shift wages after school closures. It turned out that once workers believed they would not be punished for honesty, the truth arrived in floods. Elena listened, organized, escalated, solved what she could, fought for what she couldn't. She had the rare gift of taking chaos personally without letting it master her. Victor noticed. So did everyone else. Matteo, meanwhile, recovered fully and began visiting the office lobby only on approved days, where he liked to wave solemnly at the giant portrait of Victor and whisper, "That one doesn't smile enough." Sometimes Victor heard him. More and more often, he joined Elena and Matteo for small moments that nobody in the old version of the building would have believed possible. 10 minutes in the cafe over hot chocolate. A stop by the holiday tree in the atrium. A Saturday visit to a children's science museum after Victor discovered Matteo believed planets were God's marbles. If Elena had been younger or more foolish, she might have mistaken these gestures for spectacle. But they were too consistent for that. Consistency is how wounded people recognize sincerity. One November evening, as dusk pressed blue against the windows of Victor's office, Matteo sat cross-legged on the rug with a book about trains spread across his lap. Victor, still in shirt sleeves after a 14-hour day, was helping him sound out the names of cities on a rail map. Milwaukee, Matteo said proudly. Correct. Cincinnati. Matteo squinted. That's too many letters for one place. Victor looked offended on behalf of the city. Elena laughed from the sofa, where she was reviewing next month's staff childcare proposals. The sound drew Victor's gaze. It stayed there a second longer than either of them could easily account for. There are loves that begin in fireworks, and there are loves that begin in the repeated experience of being safe. The second kind often arrives quietly enough to be mistaken for gratitude until one day it is too large to misname. Winter came early that year. On the first hard-cold evening of December, Elena's apartment building lost heat. She stood in her kitchen wearing gloves while Matteo coughed in the next room, and something old and terrified rose up inside her. She had savings now. Some stability. But stability built recently is easily frightened by weather. When Victor learned of the outage through one of the employee emergency alerts, he did not send an assistant. He drove there himself. Elena opened the door and simply stared. He stood in a wool coat, snow on his shoulders, looking somehow both absurdly out of place and completely certain of why he had come. The building manager says repairs may take 48 hours, he said. Yes. You and Matteo are coming with me. Her instinct rose instantly. No. His expression barely changed. Why? Because I can't keep doing this. This thing where you rescue us every time life tilts sideways. He stood very still. Snow drifted past the stairwell window behind him. Finally he said, "Do you know what I think rescue is?" Elena said nothing. "I think rescue is dramatic, temporary, designed to create debt in the person receiving it." His voice lowered. "That is not what this is." "Then what is it?" His answer came without hesitation. "It is attachment." The word landed between them with almost frightening clarity. He looked past her toward the dim apartment, the extra blankets, the boiling pot of water on the stove in a losing attempt to warm the air. "I am not helping you because I enjoy being indispensable," he said. "I am helping because your son matters to me, because your exhaustion matters to me, because when I leave this building at night, I find myself wondering whether you made it home safely, because the sound of Matteo laughing in my office has become one of the only things in years that made that room feel less like a mausoleum." Elena felt tears rise so quickly she could not disguise them. Victor went on, quieter now. "And because somewhere between the clinic and the whiteboard and the hot chocolate and the complaints about city lettering, you became the first person in a very long time whose presence felt less like interruption and more like order." She laughed through the tears. "That is the most Victor Hale declaration of love imaginable." He exhaled something almost like relief. "That was not the polished version." "You had a polished version?" 3. All worse. She covered her mouth, half laughing, half crying. "The truth is that people imagine hardened men soften in grand, cinematic gestures. Often they do not. Often they simply tell the truth in a doorway while snow falls and a child coughs in the next room." Elena looked at him and saw not the portrait in the lobby, not the billionaire in the magazines, but the boy who had once watched his mother humiliated for choosing him. The man standing before her had built towers because he could not bear helplessness. Yet here he was, helpless in the oldest way, waiting to see if love would be allowed to enter. "Okay," she whispered. "For the heating situation?" he asked carefully. "Or for both?" Victor closed his eyes for just a moment, the way a man might upon surviving an operation. That winter Elena and Matteo moved not into Victor's penthouse as gossip later claimed, but into the quieter lakefront townhouse he rarely used because it had once belonged to his mother after he became wealthy enough to buy her any view she wanted. She had filled it with books, plants, warm lamps, and curtains the color of cream. Nothing in it felt cold. It startled Elena to learn that Victor had kept it exactly as it was. She liked rooms that looked forgiven, he told her once. By spring, Matteo had his own room with constellation stickers on the ceiling. Elena had a garden plot in the back courtyard where basil and tomatoes fought heroically against Chicago wind. Victor still worked too much, but no longer until midnight every night. He came home earlier, ate dinner at a table instead of standing over briefing folders. Learned the astonishing complexity of 6-year-old questions. Why do grown-ups wear painful shoes? Why is soup better when you're sad? If money can buy medicine, why does it not buy kindness? That last one silenced the table for a long time. Eventually Victor answered, because kindness is not a product. It is a decision. Matteo accepted this. Children often accept profound things more easily than adults. 1 year after the day Elena had hidden her sick son in a storage room, Hale Meridian opened a childcare and family support center on its lower floors. Not a polished showroom for press photos, but a real center with licensed caregivers, medical support, quiet rooms, and emergency beds for children whose parents were caught between responsibility and disaster. Above the entrance hung a simple brass plaque, the Anna Hale Family Center. At the opening, employees stood with their children under bright banners, while cameras flashed and reporters took notes. But the most important moment happened after the speeches, when Elena found Victor alone near the window overlooking the playroom. Children's laughter rose below them like music. "She would have loved this," Elena said softly. Victor nodded. For a second, he looked almost young. "She would have corrected the furniture placement within 10 minutes. Elena smiled. "Of that I have no doubt." He reached into his coat pocket, and her pulse changed before her mind understood why. It was not a velvet box. It was better. A small silver key rested in his palm, attached to an old brass keychain etched with the number 4B. Elena stared at it. "It's from your old apartment," he said. "The landlord gave it to the movers after you left. Matteo wanted to keep it because he said it was the key to the place where the hard part ended." Her throat tightened. Victor's voice lowered. "I kept thinking about that, about endings, about doors." Then, from the other pocket came the ring. Simple, elegant. No theatrical stone large enough to blind nearby traffic. Just something beautiful and deliberate. "Elena," he said. And for once there was no billionaire polish left in him at all, only a man standing in the open with his heart visible. "You were willing to be thought irresponsible rather than abandon your son. You walked into a building designed to intimidate people like us and loved anyway. You changed my company. You changed my house. You changed me." Her vision blurred. "I used to think love destabilized people," he said. "Now I think lovelessness is what makes them dangerous. So I am asking, in a very sincere and somewhat terrifying way, whether you would marry me and continue reorganizing my entire life." Elena laughed with tears on her face, which was exactly right. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." From somewhere below, Matteo's voice rang upward. "Mama, Mr. Victor, there's tiny sandwiches." Victor looked down over the railing and called back, "That is not an emergency. It is if they run out." Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, laughing harder now. Victor slipped the ring onto her finger. When they kissed, it was not the dramatic collision of strangers in a film. It was the deep, astonished tenderness of two people who had already carried each other through enough ordinary disasters to know exactly what they were choosing. They were married in October in the courtyard behind the townhouse, under string lights and late roses and a sky so clear it looked freshly washed. Chef Bernard cried openly and claimed smoke had gotten in his eyes. Dr. Weiss brought lemon cake. Several employees from the tower came with their children dressed in uncomfortable formal clothes and expressions of tremendous importance. Matteo wore a tiny suit and carried the rings in a dinosaur-shaped box because he argued, successfully, that elegance was improved by prehistoric influence. Victor's vows were brief and devastating. "I will never make you prove your worth to me through exhaustion," he said. Elena's made half the guests cry. "You found my son in a hallway," she said, voice shaking. "But the truth is, you found all three of us there. The boy he had been, the woman I was becoming, the man you had hidden even from yourself." After the ceremony, Matteo danced until he fell asleep sitting upright in a chair, still clutching a dinner roll. Victor carried him inside. Some images become the true ending of a story not because they are grand, but because they contain everything the story was trying to say. A man once known for coldness carrying a sleeping child through warm light. A mother following behind without fear. A house not silent, but alive. Years later, people at Hale Meridian would still tell the story in fragments. How the cold millionaire carried a feverish boy through the executive corridor. How a kitchen worker became the woman who rebuilt the company's conscience. How the family center changed retention rates, lowered burnout, and quietly saved more households than any annual report could measure. How Victor Hale smiled now, not often enough for Matteo's standards, but enough that no one called him the Winter Man anymore. The magazines wrote about his policy changes. Investors praised the long-term talent gains. Analysts called it a masterstroke in adaptive labor design. Those things were not false. They were simply not the deepest truth. The deepest truth was this. A frightened mother brought her sick son to work because poverty rarely offers dignified choices. A powerful man saw in that child the wound he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. And instead of protecting the rules, he protected the people. There are moments in life when the future changes not through strategy, not through ambition, and not through the loud machinery of success, but through one unexpected act of tenderness performed by someone the world had mistaken for unfeeling. We live in an age that worships efficiency, polished surfaces, and the illusion of self-sufficiency. Yet none of those things can hold a feverish child. None of them can calm a terrified mother. None of them can replace the moral courage required to say, "Stop. A human being is in pain, and that matters more than procedure." The real measure of wealth is not what a person can accumulate behind glass walls. It is what they are willing to interrupt for love. And the real legacy we leave behind is not our titles, our towers, or the money attached to our names, but the rooms we make safer for others to enter. If there is any lesson in Elena, Matteo, and Victor's story, it is not merely that kindness changes lives. That much we already know. It is that kindness becomes most powerful when it costs something. When it delays the meeting. When it alters the budget. When it embarrasses the cruel. When it refuses to let policy speak louder than compassion. When it turns a corridor of fear into the beginning of a family. So may we be careful with the authority we hold, however small or large. May we never force love to disguise itself as negligence. May we never confuse a desperate choice with a moral failure. And if one day we are given the power to stop someone else's humiliation, may we remember that the soul is shaped in such moments. Because somewhere, in some hallway we have not yet entered, someone is carrying more than they can bear. And sometimes the most unexpected miracle is simply this. The person with the most power is the first one to kneel.